And, I wouldn't necessarily rubbish that. I'm not that down on the idea. I think you do need a powerful reorientation in order to recover from serious drink and drug addiction. I mean, not many people do, actually. We were talking before about people like Hunter Thompson or even Coleridge on a rather more exalted level who just didn't recover. And actually, the kind of cultural landscape is scattered with these crabbed, stereotypic creative people who've fallen into a kind of dead end. So I'm not knocking the conversion at all. On the other hand, as religiomania goes, I don't think anybody would mark me down as a tambourine banger or see me sort of wobbling along Oxford Street after the rest of the Hare Krishnas.
I just spotted a little analogy, and I wonder how this works for you, because here you are in the early life, you're reading Hunter Thompson, you're reading Burroughs, and these are people who certainly don't have any sort of domestic life whatsoever. They have homes hardly, or if they do, they shoot their wives from them. But here you are. And then, as it were, then there's one of the person you admire greatly later on, or perhaps from a very early stage, actually, I think you were reading when you were at school as well, but J.G. Ballard. Now, Ballard managed to combine having the most extraordinary capacity for writing strange, transgressive, surrealist novels, coupled that with a great deal of domesticity. There he is, living in a suburb in Shepperton, just round the corner from Budgeon's supermarket, and here is the man producing these elaborate postmodernist fantasies about the world.
He planted his creative spring by the hearth. I think the thing about Jim Ballard, who I first went to meet in the early 90s and who I regarded in as much as I did anybody very much as my creative mentor as a writer, and I feel very much in debt to him for his support of me over the years. The truth of the matter is that Jim, I think Jim had post-traumatic stress disorder, I mean, if you want to put a label on it, I think this was a man who had seen not just one but many people killed in front of him when he was a child. And his life in Shepperton, and I don't think that this is offensive to his family, to his children, or to people who've known him. I think his life in Shepperton was a very conscious, partly conscious and partly unconscious attempt to create a safe haven. And that the fiction, it's never good to write fiction with the view of catharsis. In our kind of operized, Winfreyized world, people always ask, is your fiction a form of therapy? Is it a form of catharsis? If that's your intention artistically, you're screwed. You'll end up in the troubled lives section of the bookstore. But Jim's fiction, undoubtedly, a side aspect of it was that it was a form of catharsis of this very, as he said himself after writing Empire of the Sun, he finally... It was almost as if he'd stuffed that childhood down, and and when he looked at his own apocalyptic fiction, stuff like High Rise and Crash, and he sort of thought, well, where are all these abandoned swimming pools and kind of empty cities coming from? And of course, it was wartime.
You would say, I know you would say that Ballard is writing fiction for our times. I mean, you are quite disparaging about what might be described as fairly conventional novels of social mores and manners and divorces and intrigues. And I mean,
I am, but I'm not. I mean, I think it's fine. It's absolutely fine. And some of it is extremely good and does things that are very good, particularly. But I think that the problem is it's a form of Kulturkampf, and it has been for a long time. And it interestingly flies in the face of what the reality is. The reality, people's kind of commonplace perception of literary history is that it kind of evolved into the great 19th century psychological realist novel, and that's some kind of epitome that's then carried forward. And then things like Joyce and kind of modernism are rather sort of sterile dead ends that kind of, well, how can you do that? Sort of slightly bonkers and mad. And anyway, it's not a thumping good read. And I think this is not only this is a culturally motivated view of the development of literature, and it's not accurate, and it's not true about what literature does. Personally, what I have an antipathy to is the idea of working within a form that is in some sense static in that way. I think that those novels can be very good. They can be very involving for people. They can be a kind of psychological and psychoempathetic working out for people. But from the writer's point of view, it is like making tables. I mean, it's sort of, I'll get up in the morning, I'll make another table. Tables are great. We need tables. They're great to eat off. They're good to sit at. I think I'll make another one. I never want to make another table. I want to make something new. I want to make something different. I want the form to feel elastic for me and dangerous. And that's how I think, art progresses, if art progresses at all, or art is involved in an evolution.
You've said, because one of the things that when people say about your books is as you've heard this many, many times, is the difficulty for feeling any empathy or sympathy for the characters. And I think you've said yourself, you're not terribly interested in characters in the sense of developing a full-blown character in a narrative. Is that something...
People hate that, don't they?
I'm just wondering if this is something that you've ever struggled against, where you've tried to create a sympathetic character, or is there something about when you sit down to write an idea of a sympathetic character doesn't occur to you? It doesn't fit into your notion of what fiction should be now?
I think both, actually. I mean, I sometimes find characters sliding into being a bit sympathetic, and I have to jerk them back.
You quickly pull them out away.
Well, I do. I think with the novel I wrote called The Book of Dave, some people said, well, it had some kind of there was some kind of catharsis at the end. There was some kind of,
Well, we feel sort of sorry. I mean,
yeah,
we know that Dave couldn't get it sorted out.
Yeah.
It was a terrible predicament he was in. But he's not lovable in any way, Dave, is he?
No, but people aren't really that lovable. And again, an aspect of the culture camp is to pretend that everybody's lovable. That's a collective delusion. Society doesn't operate because we love everybody. Society operates through sanction, through forms of collective control, through hierarchy, through the imposition of controlled forms of mass hysteria. So the novels that persuade you in the idea that everybody is intrinsically lovable are pulling off a confidence trick, as are the moral systems that delude people. We see it time and time again, Laurie, and it's true. People's capacity for empathy with people who are outside their immediate social matrix is remarkably small, and it doesn't matter whether you call on this through you validate it through evolutionary psychology, or you pull up Stanley Milgram's experiments at Yale, or whatever it is, but or the genocidal impulse that seems to exist in humanity. These are true facts. The thing is that the people will hear these arguments and they'll say, yes, but we've got to aim for something better than that. What would that world be like in which you empathised with 6.5 billion people? What would the world be like if you felt the pain of the 250,000 people who were rubbed out in Haiti a few weeks ago? What a strange place it would be.
But you see, people say about you, there are people who would say about you, they observe you, that you seem rather a cold person, but to put it at its worst, they would say that you seem rather arrogant, rather condescending, rather distant. And almost to some extent, I'm thinking of sort of when you do appear on the Vic Reeves show, you almost agree to occupy that character.
I think there are very, very few serious writers who are prepared to do light comedy the way I am.
No.
You never saw Iris Murdoch on comedy shows. No.
Why do you disdain popular culture so much? I mean,
I didn't start out that way. I started out, I think, very much, I kind of was a kid in the 1970s and loved punk and loved the nihilism of punk rock and the kind of and loved the idea that and was bought the postmodernism of that period and the idea that it was up to the intellectual to absorb popular culture and to be involved in it, and in a sense to have a sort of bouleversé, to regard popular culture as the high culture of the age. I think I have retreated from that. I think I've retreated from it. There's no doubt about it. And I was always, in some senses, uncomfortable with it because I come from a fairly typically Mandarin background in that way, though not entirely so. But I've retreated from it because so much of it is crap, actually. I mean, objectively is crap. And I think so much of that postmodern attitude is essentially patronising in its own way.
Which says that Beethoven and the Beatles can be...
Yeah. Well, I mean, Beatles are great. Let's get it wrong. But interesting, I think it's also it's also a function of the period. And it's also a function of demographics, is what began to dawn on me. And what really hit me about this, because get me wrong, I'm an old druggie who took drugs all through this period. I took ecstasy at the Wag